The note wasn't asking me to join the family vacation. It was assigning me chores while everyone else left without me. I found the card halfway through Thanksgiving dinner, tucked neatly beside my plate as if it belonged there. For a moment, I thought it was a place card, the kind people use at formal gatherings. But when I picked it up and read the words, my fingers stopped moving. Family trip. We leave tomorrow morning. Please water the plants, feed Baxter, bring in the mail, and keep the house clean. Have a wonderful week. I stared at the card while the sounds of laughter and silverware filled the dining room. No one seemed surprised. No one looked confused. No one asked what I was reading. That was the moment I realized something that hurt more than the card itself. Everyone at that table already knew about the trip. Everyone except me. My name is Margaret Collins. I was 69 years old that Thanksgiving. I had been a widow for almost 4 years, and ever since my husband Robert passed away, I had tried my best to keep our family together. Thanksgiving had always been my favorite holiday. Not because of the food, not because of tradition, because it was the one day every year when I could look around the table and see the people I loved sitting together under one roof. At least, that was what I used to believe. I had spent 2 full days preparing that meal. The turkey had been in the oven since sunrise. I made homemade stuffing the way Robert liked it. Sweet potato casserole with toasted pecans, fresh cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie from scratch. My feet ached from standing in the kitchen for hours, but I never complained. Seeing my grandchildren smile was worth every minute. Earlier that afternoon, my son Ethan had arrived with his wife Ashley and their 2 children. Ashley hugged me quickly before walking straight to the dining room to scroll through her phone. Ethan carried in a cooler and several shopping bags, but seemed distracted. The children rushed upstairs to play video games. Everything felt normal on the surface. But now, sitting there with that card in my hand, I began noticing things I had missed before. Ashley kept exchanging glances with Ethan. The children seemed excited about something they weren't talking about. There were several new suitcases lined up near the front hallway. I remembered seeing them when they arrived, but I hadn't thought much about it. Suddenly, every detail fit together. They were leaving tomorrow. And somehow, nobody had thought to tell me. I folded the card carefully and placed it beside my napkin. My heart felt heavy, but I refused to make a scene. Ashley noticed me setting the card down. She smiled. Not warmly, not apologetically, just enough to acknowledge that I had finally discovered the truth. "Everything okay, Margaret?" she asked. Her voice sounded perfectly pleasant. I looked at her for a moment. "Yes," I said quietly. "Everything's fine." She nodded and returned to her conversation as if nothing had happened. The worst part wasn't the trip. Families take vacations. People make plans. The worst part was the assumption hidden inside that card. They hadn't simply forgotten to invite me. They had already assigned me a role. Stay home, watch the house, feed the dog, collect the mail, clean up after everyone else. As if I were part of the furniture. As if I existed only to make life easier for them. Around me, dinner continued. The grandchildren laughed. Ethan discussed airline schedules. Ashley talked about beach resorts and ocean views. Nobody stopped to ask how I felt. Nobody even acknowledged that I wouldn't be going. I looked around the table I had set that morning. The candles flickered softly. The china dishes reflected the warm light overhead. Everything looked beautiful, yet I had never felt more alone. Then something else caught my attention. Ashley's purse sat open beside her chair. A corner of a folder was sticking out. Across the top was a familiar address. My address. The address of the house Robert had left to me. I only saw it for a second before Ashley zipped the purse shut. But that second was enough. Because suddenly, the card on my plate didn't feel like the real message. It felt like a distraction. And for the first time that evening, I began to wonder if the family vacation was only the beginning. That night, after everyone had gone home, I stood alone in the kitchen washing dishes that no one had offered to help clean. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rattle of branches against the windows. Thanksgiving had always left me tired, but this felt different. The exhaustion sat deeper, somewhere beneath my ribs. I kept thinking about the folder in Ashley's purse. My address. My house. Robert's house. The house we had bought 37 years ago when Ethan was still in elementary school. I dried the last plate and placed it carefully into the cabinet. Then I turned off the kitchen light and walked through the living room. Family photographs lined the shelves. Ethan at age 10 holding a baseball trophy. Robert smiling beside the fishing boat he loved. Christmas mornings. Birthday parties. School graduations. Decades of memories captured in frames. For years, those photographs had comforted me. Tonight, they felt like evidence from another life. Around 10 o'clock, my phone buzzed. A new social media post from Ashley appeared on the screen. She had uploaded a picture of several suitcases arranged near the front door. The caption read, "Vacation starts tomorrow. Cannot wait for some peace and quiet." Hundreds of people would see that photograph. Friends, co-workers, relatives. Everyone would assume I was part of the family trip. No one would know I had learned about it from a card left beside my dinner plate. I locked the phone and set it down. The next morning I woke before sunrise. Years of habit made it impossible to sleep late. Outside, frost covered the lawn. The air looked cold enough to sting your lungs. I made coffee and stood by the kitchen window. Across the street, a neighbor was hanging holiday decorations. Everything seemed normal, yet something inside me had shifted. Around 7 o'clock, Ethan's family arrived to collect the dog they planned to board before their flight. Ashley walked inside carrying a travel mug and wearing an expensive cream-colored coat. She seemed cheerful, more cheerful than she had been in months. Ethan looked tired. The children bounced around excitedly, talking about beaches and swimming pools. No one mentioned the card. No one mentioned the fact that I would be spending the week alone. Ashley handed me a spare key. "Just in case," she said. "We may need you to check on a few things while we are gone." I smiled politely and accepted it. Then she glanced toward the hallway where several family photographs hung on the wall. "You know," she said casually, "a house this size must be a lot for one person." The comment sounded harmless, but something about the way she said it made me pay attention. "I managed just fine," I replied. "Of course," she said quickly. "I only mean that eventually people start thinking about simplifying." Simplifying. The word lingered in the air long after she walked away. 20 minutes later, they left for the airport. I watched their vehicle disappear down the street. The neighborhood became quiet again. For the first time all weekend, I could hear my own thoughts. I returned to the dining room and sat in the same chair where I had found the card. The folded note still rested inside my purse. I took it out and read it again. "Family trip. Water the plants. Feed the dog. Keep the house clean." It looked less like a request now and more like an instruction. Suddenly, I remembered something Robert had said during the final year of his life. We had been sitting on the back porch watching the sunset. He had looked at me very seriously and said, "Margaret, if anything ever feels wrong after I am gone, promise me you will not ignore it." At the time, I thought he was talking about grief. Maybe he was talking about something else. I sat quietly for several minutes before standing up and walking toward my desk. Inside the bottom drawer was a small metal box containing important documents. Property records, insurance papers, tax returns. I had not opened it in months. As I sorted through the folders, my eyes landed on a sealed envelope with Robert's handwriting across the front. My heart skipped. I did not remember seeing it before. The envelope was addressed to me, and beneath my name were 5 words that instantly made my stomach tighten. "If circumstances begin to change." I sat at the desk for several seconds before touching the envelope. Robert had always been organized. Every document had a purpose. Every note had a reason. If he had written those words, he wanted me to read them only when something important changed. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the seal. Inside was a folded letter and a single business card. The card belonged to an attorney named Daniel Mercer. I recognized the name immediately. Daniel had handled several legal matters for Robert over the years. I unfolded the letter and began reading. "Margaret, if you are reading this, then something has made you uncomfortable. Trust that feeling. You are kind by nature, and kindness sometimes causes people to overlook what is right in front of them. I hope I am wrong, but if circumstances begin to change after I am gone, call Daniel before making any decisions about the house or our assets." My eyes moved slowly across the page. Robert's familiar handwriting felt like hearing his voice again after 4 long years. He went on to describe how carefully he had arranged everything to protect me. He reminded me that the house belonged solely to me. He reminded me never to sign documents without independent advice. Most importantly, he wrote one sentence that stayed with me long after I finished reading. "The people who truly love you will never rush you into decisions." I folded the letter and stared out the window. Snowflakes had begun drifting across the yard. The neighborhood looked peaceful, almost frozen in time. Yet suddenly, dozens of small memories started surfacing. Moments I had ignored. Moments I had explained away. Last spring, Ashley had suggested that I move into a smaller condominium. 6 months before that, She had asked whether I planned to update my estate documents. The previous Christmas, she spent nearly an hour asking questions about property taxes, maintenance costs, and insurance policies. At the time, I assumed she was making conversation. Now those discussions felt different, more deliberate, more focused. I stood and walked toward the bookshelf in the family room. There was a photo of Ethan at age 12 standing beside Robert. They were smiling proudly after building a treehouse together. Looking at that picture hurt. Ethan had not always been distant. When he was younger, he called me every week. He visited without being asked. He remembered birthdays and anniversaries. Somewhere along the way, things changed. The realization brought tears to my eyes, but only for a moment. I wiped them away and returned to the desk. Then I called Daniel Mercer. To my surprise, he answered immediately. After introducing myself, there was a brief silence on the line. "Margaret," he said gently, "I have wondered whether you would ever call." The comment made my stomach tighten. We spoke for nearly 40 minutes. Daniel could not discuss every detail over the phone, but he confirmed something important. Robert had met with him several times during his final year. They had reviewed every asset, every account, and every property document. "Your husband was very thorough," Daniel said. "He wanted to ensure that you would always be protected." Then his voice became more careful. "Have there been any recent conversations about your house?" I thought about Ashley's comments. Simplifying. Managing a large property alone. Future plans. Family convenience. "Yes," I answered quietly. "There have been a few." Another pause followed. "Margaret," Daniel said, "I think it would be wise for you to come by my office when your family returns. There are some documents you should review." When the call ended, I sat motionless in the silence. Outside, the snowfall continued. Inside, the house felt different. Not lonely. Not forgotten. Alert. As though pieces of a puzzle were finally beginning to connect. I glanced once more at Robert's letter. Then I noticed something I had missed earlier. At the bottom of the page, beneath his signature, he had written a short note in smaller handwriting. "If Daniel ever asks you to review the Blue Harbor file, do it immediately." I had never heard of a Blue Harbor file, but somehow, I knew it was connected to everything. The name stayed in my mind for the rest of the day. Blue Harbor. I had gone through nearly every financial document Robert ever kept, and yet I could not remember seeing those words anywhere. By evening, curiosity had become determination. I returned to the metal box and carefully examined every folder again. Tax records, property insurance, bank statements, investment summaries. Everything appeared ordinary. Then I noticed a thin file tucked beneath a stack of older papers. It was so flat that I had overlooked it twice. Across the tab, written in Robert's handwriting, were the words Blue Harbor. My pulse quickened. I carried the file to the kitchen table and opened it slowly. Inside were copies of legal documents, property records, and several letters exchanged between Robert and Daniel Mercer. Most of the language was formal and difficult to follow, but one detail immediately stood out. Blue Harbor was not a business. It was the name of a trust. A trust Robert had created less than a year before he passed away. I read every page twice. Then a third time. The trust contained the lakefront cottage Robert and I had purchased 20 years earlier. The place where we celebrated anniversaries. The place where Ethan learned to fish. The place where our grandchildren built sandcastles along the shoreline during summer vacations. According to the documents, ownership of the cottage had been transferred into the trust, with me named as the sole lifetime beneficiary. After my passing, the property would eventually transfer to Ethan's children, not Ethan himself. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the papers. Suddenly, several conversations from the past few years made sense. Ashley had repeatedly asked whether I planned to sell the cottage. She had once suggested it could fund a comfortable retirement community. Another time she mentioned how valuable lakefront property had become. I remembered how interested she seemed whenever the cottage came up. At the time, I assumed she was making conversation. Now I wondered if she knew more than she had ever admitted. The next morning, I drove to the cottage. The trip took a little over an hour. Winter had already settled across the countryside. Bare trees lined the highway. The lake itself looked calm and gray beneath an overcast sky. As I pulled into the driveway, a strange sense of peace washed over me. Robert had loved this place. Every board, every stone path, every flower bed carried memories of his careful attention. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of cedar and old books. Everything appeared exactly as we had left it. Yet as I walked through the rooms, something felt off. It was not damage. It was not disorder. It was a feeling. The kind Robert always told me not to ignore. In the study, I noticed a drawer that had not been fully closed. That alone was unusual. Robert had been meticulous. I opened it and found several recent real estate brochures. Luxury properties, retirement communities, downsizing guides. They were not mine. I had never seen them before. Tucked inside one brochure was a business card. The name printed across the front belonged to a real estate agent located less than 15 miles away. On the back, someone had written a note. Call after Thanksgiving. Discuss timeline. I stood very still. Outside, small waves tapped gently against the shoreline. Inside, the silence felt heavier than before. Someone had been making plans. Plans involving property that did not belong to them. Plans connected to dates and conversations that suddenly seemed far too specific to be coincidences. I slipped the card into my purse and looked around the quiet room once more. Then my phone vibrated. A new message had arrived from Ashley. It contained only one sentence. Hope everything is going smoothly at home. Reading those words, I realized she believed I was exactly where she expected me to be. Distracted, isolated, unaware. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I allowed myself a small smile. Because she was wrong. For the next 2 days, I said nothing. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to call Ethan and ask questions. Every emotion pushed me toward confrontation. But Robert had always believed that facts were stronger than assumptions. So I waited. I listened. I paid attention. The real estate card remained in my purse. The trust documents stayed locked inside the metal box. Each morning I made coffee, sat by the window, and reviewed everything I had learned. By Wednesday afternoon, another piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly. My neighbor Linda stopped by with a container of homemade soup. She was one of those people who always seemed to know what was happening in town before anyone else. We sat at the kitchen table while snow drifted across the backyard. The conversation started normally. Weather, holiday decorations, local events. Then she casually mentioned something that made me nearly drop my spoon. I ran into Ashley a few weeks ago, Linda said. She seemed excited about your move. I stared at her. My move. Linda nodded. That is what she called it. She said you were considering a major lifestyle change and that everyone was helping with the transition. For several seconds, I could not speak. I had never discussed moving with Ashley. I had never announced plans to leave my house. Yet somehow she was telling people that a transition was already underway. Did she say where I was moving? I finally asked. Linda frowned as she tried to remember. Not exactly. Something about a smaller place being easier to manage. She made it sound like everything had already been decided. After Linda left, I sat alone for a long time. The room felt colder than before. Ashley was not simply asking questions. She was creating a narrative. She was preparing people to believe a decision had already been made. That evening I drove into town and visited the address printed on the real estate card. The office belonged to a small but successful agency specializing in retirement properties and lakefront homes. Through the front window, I could see photographs of smiling couples standing beside sold signs. I did not go inside. Instead, I sat in my car across the street and watched. 20 minutes later, a familiar vehicle pulled into the parking lot. My breath caught. It belonged to Ethan. I watched him walk into the office carrying a folder. He looked comfortable, familiar, like someone who had visited before. I remained parked where I was. There could have been innocent explanations. There usually were. Yet deep down, I knew this was not innocent. Not anymore. Ethan stayed inside for almost 40 minutes. When he finally emerged, he shook hands with someone near the entrance and smiled. Then he drove away. I followed several minutes later, my thoughts racing the entire drive home. That night, I called Daniel Mercer again. This time I told him everything. The trust, the brochures, the real estate office, Linda's comments, Ethan's visit. Daniel listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, the line remained silent for a moment. Then he said something that sent a chill through me. Margaret, there is a reason Robert established the trust the way he did. He was concerned that someone might eventually pressure you into decisions that benefited them more than you. I closed my eyes. Hearing those words spoken aloud made everything feel real. What should I do? I asked quietly. Daniel's answer came immediately. Do not confront anyone. Not yet. Come see me the day after your family returns. There are documents you need to review before any conversations take place. After the call ended, I walked into the family room and looked at Robert's photograph above the fireplace. For the first time since his passing, I felt something stronger than grief. I felt clarity. Someone had been making plans for my future without my knowledge. What they did not realize was that I had finally started paying attention. The family returned on Sunday evening. I knew because Ashley began posting photographs before their plane even landed. Beach sunsets, resort dinners, smiling selfies. Looking at them, nobody would have guessed that an entire week of planning had taken place back home while they enjoyed their vacation. By the time Ethan called, I was already prepared. "Everything okay?" he asked casually. "The house is fine," I replied. "The dog is fine. The mail is stacked neatly on the counter." He sounded relieved. We spoke for less than 3 minutes. Not once did he ask how I had spent the holiday week. Not once did he ask whether I felt hurt about being excluded. After the call ended, I sat quietly in the family room. The silence no longer felt lonely. It felt useful. The next morning I drove to Daniel Mercer's office. His building occupied the second floor of a brick structure downtown. Robert and I had visited many times over the years. Walking through those doors brought back memories of tax meetings, estate planning discussions, and long conversations about protecting the future. Daniel greeted me personally and led me into a conference room. Several folders already sat on the table. The Blue Harbor documents were among them. "Before we begin," Daniel said, "I want you to understand something important. Everything Robert established was legal, deliberate, and designed to prevent exactly the kind of situation you have described." He opened the first folder. Inside were records I had never seen before. Meeting notes, legal correspondence, trust instructions. Robert had anticipated potential pressure long before his health declined. Not because he distrusted Ethan, because he understood how easily people can be influenced by those around them. Then Daniel showed me something that made my chest tighten. A copy of an inquiry submitted nearly 8 months earlier. The request had come through a real estate professional seeking information about ownership structures connected to the lakefront cottage. The inquiry had not succeeded because the trust protected the property. But the name attached to the request was familiar. Ashley Collins. I stared at the page. Seeing it in writing felt different from suspicion, different from assumptions. This was evidence. "Can she access the trust?" I asked. Daniel shook his head. "No, can Ethan? Not without your authorization." Relief washed over me, but only briefly. Daniel slid another document across the table. "There is more." The second file contained notes from conversations with financial advisors. Over the past year, someone had repeatedly sought estimates regarding the value of both my primary residence and the cottage. Again, Ashley's name appeared. Sometimes Ethan's. Sometimes both. I closed my eyes for a moment. Suddenly, every conversation made sense. The comments about simplifying, the discussions about maintenance, the retirement brochures, the real estate office. None of it had been random. It was a strategy, a gradual effort to guide me toward decisions that would benefit them. Daniel allowed the silence to settle before speaking again. "Margaret, you still control everything. Nothing has been lost. But now, you know what you are dealing with." When the meeting ended, he handed me copies of the most important documents. I carried them carefully to my car. Outside, the winter air felt crisp and clear. For the first time in weeks, I was no longer confused. I was no longer searching for answers. I had them. As I pulled into my driveway later that afternoon, I noticed Ethan's vehicle parked in front of the house. Ashley stood beside him on the porch. They were waiting for me, and judging by the expressions on their faces, they had come to discuss my future. For a moment, none of us spoke. I stepped out of my car and looked at Ethan and Ashley standing on my porch. Ashley smiled first. It was the same polished smile she used whenever she wanted something. Ethan shifted his weight and shoved his hands into his coat pockets. He looked uncomfortable. Ashley, on the other hand, looked prepared. "Margaret," she said warmly, "we were hoping to catch you before dinner." I unlocked the front door and invited them inside. The house felt different now. A week earlier, I would have walked into that conversation with uncertainty. Now I carried facts. That changed everything. We settled into the family room. Ashley immediately took control of the conversation. "We have been talking a lot during the trip," she began. "About family, about the future, about making sure everyone is happy." I nodded politely. "That sounds important." She leaned forward. "We are worried about you being here alone." There it was. The opening move. Familiar. Predictable. Ethan finally spoke. Mom, we just want what is best for you. I looked at him carefully. His voice sounded sincere. That was what made the situation so sad. I no longer knew where his thoughts ended and Ashley's began. Ashley continued. This house is a lot of responsibility. The stairs, the maintenance, the yard work. We think there might be better options. Better options. Another phrase I had heard before. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. What kind of options? Ashley glanced at Ethan before answering. A smaller place. Maybe a retirement community. Somewhere with activities and support. The room became quiet. I could almost hear Robert's voice in my memory. The people who truly love you will never rush you into decisions. Ashley was already rushing. She had arrived with a solution before asking whether there was a problem. That is thoughtful, I said. Have you been researching these options? Ashley brightened immediately. Actually, yes. We have gathered a lot of information. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I recognized it instantly. The same type of retirement brochures I had found at the cottage. She spread them across the coffee table. Pictures of smiling seniors. Walking trails. Community dining rooms. Fitness centers. Everything looked pleasant. Everything looked carefully prepared. These places have waiting lists, Ashley explained. It is smart to start early. Ethan nodded beside her. We just want to make sure you are taken care of. I listened quietly. Then I noticed something interesting. Neither of them mentioned the house itself. Not directly. They talked about comfort, convenience, simplicity. But the house sat in the middle of every sentence like an invisible third participant. Finally, Ashley asked the question she had been building toward all evening. Have you thought about what you would do with the property if you moved? There it was. Not concern. Not companionship. Property. I looked at the brochures. Then I looked at the folder in her hands. Then I looked at my son. No, I answered calmly. I have not made any decisions. Ashley's smile tightened slightly. Of course, there is no rush. The irony almost made me laugh. For weeks, perhaps months, she had been laying groundwork for a future she assumed would happen. Yet now she was pretending patience. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes. I asked questions. I listened carefully. I revealed nothing. By the time they left, Ashley seemed satisfied. She believed the meeting had gone well. She believed I was considering her suggestions. She believed she was still controlling the narrative. After their car disappeared down the street, I walked to my desk and opened the folder Daniel had given me. On top sat a document I had not reviewed yet. Across the first page were 3 words. That immediately caught my attention. Proposed transition plan. And beneath them was a date from nearly 4 months earlier. I stared at the document for a long time. Proposed transition plan. The title sounded harmless. Professional. Thoughtful even. But as I turned the pages, the truth became impossible to ignore. The document outlined a timeline. Month 1 involved introducing conversations about simplifying my lifestyle. Month 2 focused on researching alternative housing options. Month 3 suggested preparing the property for eventual sale. Month 4 included coordinating with financial advisors and real estate professionals. Every step was carefully organized. Every step pointed toward the same outcome. Me leaving my home. What disturbed me most was not the plan itself. It was the date. The proposal had been created nearly 4 months earlier. Long before Ashley sat in my living room pretending these ideas had only recently occurred to her. Long before she handed me retirement brochures and spoke about convenience. Someone had been working toward this goal for a very long time. I continued reading. Several names appeared throughout the document. Financial consultants, real estate professionals, property evaluators. Then I reached a page containing handwritten notes. The handwriting was not Ashley's. It belonged to Ethan. I recognized it immediately. My heart sank. There, in my son's own handwriting, were comments discussing potential sale values and estimated timelines. Nothing cruel. Nothing openly malicious. Yet seeing those notes felt like losing something I could never recover. For days I had wondered whether Ethan understood what was happening, whether he was simply following Ashley's lead. Now I knew he had participated, at least to some degree. I closed the folder and sat quietly. Outside, the sun was setting behind the trees. The house glowed with soft orange light. Robert used to love this hour of the day. He called it the honest hour because everything seemed clearer just before darkness arrived. For the first time, I understood exactly what he meant. The next morning I returned to Daniel's office. I placed the transition plan on his desk. Without saying a word, he reviewed it carefully. His expression never changed, but when he finished, he folded his hands and looked directly at me. Margaret, this document confirms what we suspected, that they wanted the house. I asked. More than that, he replied. It shows coordinated planning based on assumptions they had no authority to make. He opened another folder and slid several papers toward me. I think it is time you review these as well. The documents contained updated trust instructions Robert had prepared shortly before his death. I read them slowly. Then I read them again. The Blue Harbor Trust was even stronger than I realized. Not only was the cottage protected, but specific provisions prevented any sale, transfer, or restructuring without my direct approval. Robert had anticipated pressure from every direction. He had built safeguards around the future he wanted for me and for our grandchildren. As I left Daniel's office, I felt something unfamiliar. Confidence. Not anger. Not revenge. Confidence. For weeks I had been reacting to discoveries. Now I finally understood my position. I was not the vulnerable person Ashley believed I was. I was not dependent on anyone's approval. I was not standing on unstable ground. Everything Robert built remained intact. 2 days later, Ashley called. Her voice sounded unusually cheerful. She invited me to dinner the following Saturday. Just family, she said warmly. We thought it would be nice to spend time together. I accepted immediately. After we ended the call, I placed my phone on the table and looked at the stack of documents beside me. The trust records, the inquiries, the transition plan, the real estate information. Every piece of the puzzle was finally in place. Whatever Ashley expected from that dinner, she believed she was still leading the conversation. She believed I remained unaware of everything happening behind the scenes. I smiled softly and gathered the folders into a neat stack. For the first time since finding that card at Thanksgiving, I was looking forward to seeing my family. Saturday arrived cold and clear. I drove to Ethan and Ashley's house just before 6 o'clock. Christmas lights glowed along the roofline, and through the front windows I could see my grandchildren setting the table. Everything looked warm, welcoming, normal. If I had not known the truth, I might have believed this was simply a family dinner. Ashley greeted me at the door with a bright smile. Ethan hugged me briefly. The children rushed over to show me drawings they had made at school. For a few moments, I allowed myself to enjoy it. None of this was their fault. We sat down to eat. Conversation flowed easily at first. School projects, holiday plans, vacation stories. Ashley seemed unusually relaxed, confident. She believed the future she had planned was already moving in the direction she wanted. Halfway through dinner, she gently steered the conversation exactly where I expected. Margaret, she said, setting down her fork, have you had any more thoughts about simplifying things? Ethan glanced toward me. No pressure, Mom. We just want you to consider all your options. I placed my napkin beside my plate. Then I reached into my bag and removed a folder. The room became quiet. Ashley's smile flickered for the first time all evening. Actually, I said calmly, I have spent the last few weeks reviewing quite a few options. I opened the folder and placed several documents on the table. Trust records, property documents, legal correspondence. I watched Ashley recognize them one by one. The color slowly drained from her face. Ethan leaned forward and picked up the first page. What is this? He asked. Protection, I answered softly. Your father created these documents years ago. Silence settled across the table. I explained everything. The trust, the cottage, the safeguards Robert had established, the legal restrictions, the inquiries that had been made, the proposed transition plan. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I simply presented facts. Ashley tried to interrupt twice. Then she stopped. There was nothing to argue with. The documents spoke for themselves. Ethan read page after page. His expression changed with every document. Confusion, surprise, then something deeper. Regret. Finally, he looked up at me. Mom, I did not know about most of this. I believed him. Not entirely innocent. Not entirely guilty. Just someone who had allowed himself to drift too far without asking enough questions. Ashley stared at the table. For once, she had no prepared response. No carefully crafted explanation. No persuasive speech. The plan she had spent months building had collapsed under the weight of the truth. I folded my hands and looked around the room. I am not moving, I said quietly. I am not selling my home. I am not selling the cottage. And I will continue making my own decisions. Nobody spoke. Your father worked very hard to protect our family, I continued, especially the grandchildren. That protection remains in place. My granddaughter reached across the table and slipped her small hand into mine. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to my eyes. Ethan lowered his gaze. I am sorry, Mom. It was not a perfect apology. It was not enough to erase everything. But it was honest. And honesty was more valuable than excuses. A few minutes later, I gathered my documents and stood. Nobody tried to stop me. At the door, I paused and looked back one final time. Ashley sat quietly. Ethan stared at the papers spread across the table. For the first time, they were looking at reality instead of assumptions. Then I stepped outside into the cold evening air. Snowflakes drifted softly beneath the streetlights. The world felt calm. Not because I had won something. Because I had finally stopped letting other people decide who I was. They thought they were planning my future. What they never understood was that my future had already been protected by someone who truly loved me. And for the first time since Robert passed away, I walked toward it with complete confidence.